The bloody dental pick was still dripping when Monica handed it to the next patient. I watched in frozen horror from the reception desk as she wiped it with the same grimy towel she'd been using all morning, gave it a quick spray with what I thought was disinfectant, and placed it directly into Mrs. Patterson's mouth. The elderly woman had no idea that the instrument scraping against her gums had just been used on another patient who'd been bleeding heavily from severe gingivitis. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That moment, at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon at Riverside Dental Associates, changed everything I thought I knew about the medical profession, about trust, and about the people I'd been working alongside for 3 years. Monica Torres wasn't just cutting corners on sanitation protocols. She was operating what I would soon discover was a systematic operation of medical negligence that put hundreds of patients at risk of hepatitis, HIV, and infections that could kill them. But the dirty instruments were just the beginning. What I uncovered over the next 6 weeks would expose a conspiracy of insurance fraud, patient endangerment, and criminal cover-ups that reached from our small suburban practice all the way to the state dental board. The woman I'd trusted to handle sterile procedures had been running a criminal enterprise disguised as healthcare, and she had no idea that the quiet office manager sitting 10 feet away was about to bring her entire world crashing down. My name is Jessica Reynolds, and until 6 months ago, I was the office manager at what everyone considered the most reputable dental practice in Millbrook County. Riverside Dental Associates had been serving our community for over 20 years, built from the ground up by Dr. William Chen, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who genuinely cared about his patients and took pride in providing quality dental care to families who couldn't always afford the premium practices downtown. I'd started working there right after finishing my degree in healthcare administration, drawn by Dr. Chen's reputation for integrity and his commitment to treating patients regardless of their ability to pay. The practice was housed in a converted Victorian home on Maple Street, painted a welcoming sage green with white trim, surrounded by old oak trees that provided shade in the summer and a canopy of golden leaves each fall. Inside, Dr. Chen had created an environment that felt more like visiting a favorite relative than undergoing medical procedures. The waiting room featured comfortable armchairs instead of sterile plastic seating, walls lined with local landscape photography, and a coffee station where patients could help themselves to fresh brewed beverages while they waited. Dr. Chen believed that reducing anxiety was half the battle in dental care, and his approach had earned him a loyal following of families who'd been coming to him for decades. Children who'd had their first cleanings in his chair now brought their own kids for checkups. My role as office manager encompassed everything from scheduling appointments and managing insurance claims to ordering supplies and maintaining patient records. I took pride in keeping the practice running smoothly, ensuring that Dr. Chen could focus on what he did best while I handled the administrative complexities that modern healthcare required. It was demanding work, but I found it fulfilling to be part of a practice that genuinely made a difference in people's lives. Dr. Chen had always been meticulous about cleanliness and safety protocols. During my orientation 3 years ago, he'd spent an entire afternoon walking me through the sterilization procedures, explaining how each instrument had to be properly cleaned, disinfected, and sterilized between patients. He showed me the autoclave machine that used high-pressure steam to kill all bacteria and viruses, the ultrasonic cleaner that removed debris from hard-to-reach crevices, and the detailed logs we maintained to track every step of the process. The importance of these procedures couldn't be overstated, he'd explained. Dental instruments came into contact with blood and saliva, creating potential pathways for transmitting serious diseases. Hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and HIV could all be passed from patient to patient through contaminated instruments. Even less serious infections could cause significant complications, particularly for elderly patients or those with compromised immune systems. There was no room for shortcuts when it came to patient safety. For my first 2 years at the practice, I'd watched Chen and his longtime dental hygienist, Patricia Hoffman, follow these protocols religiously. Patricia had been with the practice for 15 years and was as committed to safety as Dr. Chen himself. She treated each sterilization cycle like a sacred ritual, checking and double-checking every step, maintaining detailed logs, and training anyone who worked with instruments in the proper procedures. But Patricia retired last spring, and that's when Monica Torres joined the practice. Monica came to us with impressive credentials and glowing references from her previous position at a large dental group in the state capital. She was in her early 30s, energetic and confident, with a dental hygienist license and specialized training in periodontal therapy. During her interview, she spoke knowledgeably about the latest techniques in preventative care and showed genuine enthusiasm for patient education. Dr. Chen was impressed by her qualifications and relieved to find someone who could fill Patricia's considerable shoes. I liked Monica immediately. She had an easy laugh and a warm manner with patients that put them at ease even during uncomfortable procedures. She was also incredibly efficient, able to complete cleanings and basic treatments in less time than Patricia had required, which allowed us to serve more patients and reduce the lengthy waiting lists that had developed during our search for a new hygienist. Monica seemed to adapt quickly to our practice's rhythm and procedures. She arrived early each morning to prepare treatment rooms, stayed late to ensure everything was properly cleaned and organized for the next day, and volunteered to take on additional responsibilities that made everyone's job easier. Dr. Chen was delighted with his new hire, often commenting on how smoothly the practice was running since Monica's arrival. But there were small things that bothered me, inconsistencies that I initially dismissed, but that gradually accumulated into a pattern of concern. Monica would sometimes emerge from treatment rooms more quickly than seemed possible for proper cleanup, claiming she'd developed more efficient methods during her previous job. I'd occasionally noticed that sterilization logs were filled out in batches rather than after each individual cycle, suggesting they might be completed from memory rather than real-time documentation. Most troubling were the moments when I'd glance into treatment rooms between patients and see Monica working with instruments that I could swear I'd seen her use just minutes earlier on another patient. When I mentioned this to her, she'd explain that we had multiple sets of identical tools, or that I'd seen her preparing instruments for the next patient rather than using them on the current one. Her explanations were always plausible, delivered with a confidence that made me question my own observations. I began to pay closer attention, developing what I told myself was a natural concern for quality control, rather than suspicion of a colleague I'd grown to respect. I started noting the timing of sterilization cycles, observing the flow of instruments between patients, and checking the autoclave logs more carefully than I had when Patricia was handling these responsibilities. The pattern that emerged was subtle but unmistakable. Monica was completing patient treatments faster than the sterilization process would allow for full protocol compliance. The autoclave required a minimum of 18 minutes for a complete sterilization cycle, plus time for cleaning and preparation beforehand. Yet Monica was somehow managing to treat patients scheduled just 15 minutes apart, using instruments that should have been in the sterilization process during her previous appointment. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps Monica had developed a more efficient workflow that I didn't understand. Maybe she was using a larger inventory of instruments than Patricia had required, allowing for proper rotation through the sterilization process. It was possible that my timing observations were inaccurate, influenced by my limited understanding of the clinical procedures. But the mathematics didn't work. I'd been managing the supply orders for 3 years and knew exactly how many instruments we owned. I understood the scheduling system better than anyone and could calculate the time available between appointments. Unless Monica had somehow acquired additional instruments without my knowledge, or had access to sterilization equipment I wasn't aware of, she couldn't possibly be following proper protocols while maintaining her treatment schedule. The situation came to a head on that Tuesday afternoon in October. Dr. Chen was at a dental conference in Chicago, leaving Monica to handle all the hygiene appointments while I managed the office. We had a full schedule of 12 patients booked between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., a pace that would challenge even the most efficient hygienist, working with proper sterilization protocols. I'd been watching Monica's workflow throughout the morning, timing her appointments and noting when instruments went into and came out of the sterilization process. By lunchtime, I was certain that she was reusing instruments without proper sterilization between patients. The timing simply didn't allow for anything else. After lunch, Mrs. Patterson arrived for her 2:30 appointment. Margaret Patterson was 73 years old, a retired school teacher who'd been coming to Dr. Chen for over a decade. She had diabetes and took blood thinners for a heart condition, factors that made her particularly susceptible to infections and slow to heal from even minor injuries. She was exactly the type of patient who couldn't afford to be exposed to contaminated instruments. I positioned myself at the reception desk with a clear view into treatment room 2, pretending to work on insurance claims while actually documenting everything I observed. Monica's previous patient, a young man with obvious signs of advanced gum disease, had left the room at 2:15 after a scaling procedure that had produced considerable bleeding. The instruments used in his treatment should have required immediate cleaning and sterilization, a process that would take at least 30 minutes to complete properly. Instead, I watched Monica quickly rinse the instruments in the sink, wipe them with a towel that had been sitting on the counter all day, and spray them with what appeared to be a simple antiseptic rather than proper disinfectant. She then placed these same instruments directly into the sterile setup for Mrs. Patterson's appointment. That's when I saw the bloody dental pick, still dripping with the previous patient's saliva and blood, being prepared for use on an elderly diabetic woman whose compromised immune system made her extraordinarily vulnerable to infection. The casual way Monica handled the contaminated instrument, the complete absence of proper sterilization protocols, and the obvious danger to Mrs. Patterson's health crystallized everything I'd been suspecting into horrifying certainty. Monica wasn't just cutting corners or working inefficiently. She was deliberately bypassing safety protocols that existed to prevent the transmission of deadly diseases. She was putting every single patient at risk of hepatitis, HIV, and other blood-borne pathogens while maintaining the facade of professional medical care. I sat frozen at my desk, watching Mrs. Patterson settle into the dental chair, completely unaware that the instruments about to be used in her mouth had just been contaminated with another patient's blood. My mind raced through the implications of what I was witnessing. How many patients had been exposed to contaminated instruments? How long had this been going on? Were there other safety protocols Monica was ignoring? But my immediate concern was Mrs. Patterson. I couldn't allow her to be treated with those contaminated instruments, but I also couldn't create a scene that would terrify her or alert Monica to my suspicions before I understood the full scope of what was happening. I stood up from my desk and walked toward treatment room 2, my heart pounding as I tried to appear calm and professional. Through the open doorway, I could see Monica adjusting the overhead light while Mrs. Patterson rinsed with mouthwash, unaware that her hygienist was preparing to use instruments contaminated with another patient's blood. "Monica," I called out, hoping my voice sounded normal. "Could you come here for a moment? There's an issue with Mrs. Patterson's insurance authorization that we need to resolve before her treatment." Monica looked up with mild irritation, clearly not wanting to interrupt her workflow. "Can't it wait until after the cleaning? We're already running a few minutes behind." "I'm afraid not," I insisted, gesturing toward my computer screen. "The insurance company is on the phone, and they need to speak with you about the treatment codes before they'll authorize coverage." Mrs. Patterson immediately became concerned about potential costs. "Oh my, I thought everything was covered under my plan. Should I reschedule if there's going to be a problem?" "Let's sort this out right now," I assured her, while Monica reluctantly left the treatment room to join me at the reception desk. Once Monica was away from the contaminated instruments, I improvised a complicated story about insurance pre-authorization requirements, keeping her occupied with fake phone calls and paperwork, while I tried to figure out how to prevent Mrs. Patterson's exposure without revealing my suspicions. I suggested that we reschedule the appointment for later in the week when Dr. Chen would be back to handle any insurance complications personally. Mrs. Patterson, relieved not to face unexpected costs, agreed to reschedule and left the office. Monica seemed annoyed by the delay, but accepted my explanation and began preparing for the next patient. I watched as she casually disposed of the contaminated instruments, tossing them into the cleaning sink as if they were ordinary tools rather than biohazards that could have transmitted deadly diseases. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of appointments that I now viewed with completely different eyes. Every patient who entered Monica's treatment room was potentially being exposed to contaminated instruments. Every procedure she performed was a violation of basic medical safety protocols. Every smile and professional greeting masked a criminal disregard for patient welfare. I began documenting everything I observed, taking notes on the timing of appointments, the flow of instruments, and the shortcuts Monica employed in her sterilization procedures. I photographed the autoclave logs, noting discrepancies between recorded sterilization cycles and actual patient treatments. I made detailed records of which instruments were used on which patients and how they were processed between appointments. By the end of the day, I had accumulated evidence of multiple safety violations that put every patient at serious risk. But I also realized that what I'd witnessed was just the surface of a much larger problem. If Monica was willing to reuse contaminated instruments, what other safety protocols was she ignoring? How extensive was the danger to our patients, and how long had it been going on? That evening, after Monica had left for the day, I remained in the office to conduct a more thorough investigation. I examined the sterilization equipment, reviewed patient records, and searched through supply orders and maintenance logs. What I discovered was far worse than I had imagined. The autoclave machine, which should have been running multiple cycles throughout each day, showed usage patterns that couldn't possibly accommodate proper sterilization of all instruments used in patient care. The maintenance logs revealed that several recommended service appointments had been skipped, potentially compromising the effectiveness of sterilization cycles that were actually performed. Most disturbing were the supply records. Monica had been ordering significantly fewer sterilization pouches, cleaning solutions, and biological indicators than would be required for proper protocol compliance. The inventory of instruments hadn't increased since her arrival, despite her increased patient volume, confirming that she was reusing tools without adequate processing. I also found evidence that Monica had been modifying patient records, altering treatment codes and procedures in ways that suggested insurance fraud. Routine cleanings were being billed as more complex periodontal treatments, generating higher reimbursements while potentially providing substandard care. Some patients were being charged for procedures that appeared never to have been performed, while others were receiving treatments that weren't properly documented. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The scope of what I was uncovering grew with each document I examined. Monica wasn't just ignoring safety protocols. She was operating a systematic scheme of medical fraud and patient endangerment. She was stealing from insurance companies, putting patients at risk of serious infections, and potentially billing for services that were never provided. But perhaps most troubling was the realization that some patients might already have been harmed. I pulled medical records for patients who'd been treated by Monica over the past several months, looking for patterns of infections, complications, or unusual healing problems that might indicate exposure to contaminated instruments. What I found made my blood run cold. Several patients had developed post-treatment infections that required antibiotic therapy. Others had experienced unusual healing complications or required additional procedures to address problems that developed after routine cleanings. While these issues could have natural explanations, the frequency and patterns suggested a common cause that aligned perfectly with contaminated instrument exposure. I thought about Mrs. Patterson, whom I'd managed to protect that afternoon, but also about all the patients I hadn't been able to protect over the previous months. How many people had been exposed to hepatitis or HIV? How many had developed infections that they attributed to bad luck rather than medical negligence? How many were walking around right now, unaware that their routine dental cleaning had exposed them to potentially deadly diseases? The weight of responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders. I possessed evidence of systematic medical malpractice that was putting people's lives at risk, but I also faced the challenge of exposing it without destroying the practice that served as a vital healthcare resource for our community. Dr. Chen was innocent of Monica's crimes, but his reputation and livelihood would inevitably be damaged by the scandal that would follow. I also had to consider my own position. Monica was popular with patients and appeared to have Dr. Chen's complete confidence. If I made accusations without overwhelming evidence, she could easily discredit me as a disgruntled employee or claim that I was misunderstanding clinical procedures I wasn't trained to evaluate. My word alone wouldn't be sufficient to convince anyone that a licensed dental hygienist was deliberately endangering patients. But I couldn't remain silent. Every day that Monica continued working meant more patients exposed to contaminated instruments, more insurance fraud, and more potential victims of her criminal negligence. I had a moral and legal obligation to protect the patients who trusted our practice with their health and safety. Over the next several days, I developed a comprehensive plan to document Monica's violations and build an irrefutable case against her. I would need photographs, audio recordings, detailed logs, and expert testimony to prove that she was systematically violating safety protocols. I would need evidence of the insurance fraud, documentation of patient harm, and proof that she was aware of the risks she was creating. Most importantly, I would need to protect future patients while I gathered this evidence. I couldn't allow Monica to continue contaminating instruments while I built my case, but I also couldn't alert her to my investigation before I had sufficient proof to ensure she would be stopped permanently. The plan I devised would require careful timing, meticulous documentation, and considerable personal risk. Monica had demonstrated a willingness to endanger patients for personal gain, suggesting she wouldn't hesitate to retaliate against anyone who threatened to expose her. But the alternative was allowing her criminal behavior to continue indefinitely, putting countless more patients at risk of serious harm. I spent the weekend preparing for what would become the most challenging and dangerous period of my professional life. I was about to go to war with someone who had already proven she would prioritize her own interests over patient safety, and I would have to be smarter, more careful, and more determined than she was if I wanted to protect the innocent people who trusted our practice with their health. The woman who walked into Riverside Dental Associates the following Monday morning was no longer just an office manager concerned about workplace efficiency. She was an undercover investigator with a mission to expose medical malpractice and protect patients from a criminal who had been hiding behind the facade of healthcare professionalism. Monica greeted me that morning with her usual cheerful smile, completely unaware that I was about to begin systematically documenting every aspect of her criminal operation. She had no idea that the quiet woman who managed the administrative details of her workplace was about to become the architect of her professional destruction. But first, I had to make sure no more patients were harmed while I gathered the evidence needed to stop her permanently. The investigation I was about to undertake would test every skill I'd developed in healthcare administration, every ethical principle I'd learned about patient advocacy, and every ounce of courage I possessed. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Patients' lives hung in the balance, and failure to properly document Monica's crimes could mean she would continue endangering people indefinitely. But success would bring its own challenges, including the destruction of the practice I'd worked to build, and the betrayal of trust with a colleague I'd considered a friend. As I settled into my desk that Monday morning, watching Monica prepare for her first patient of the day, I knew there was no turning back. The evidence I'd already gathered was too damning to ignore, and the moral obligation to protect patients was too strong to abandon. The quiet office manager was about to become a whistleblower, and Monica Torres was about to discover that her crimes had been witnessed by someone with the skills, determination, and ethical commitment to ensure she would face justice for every patient she had endangered. The next morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Monica breezed through the front door at exactly 7:30, carrying her usual coffee in Danish from the bakery down the street, chatting pleasantly about the weather as she prepared for another day of systematically endangering patients. I responded with practiced casualness, while internally steeling myself for what would become the most intensive covert investigation of my life. My first priority was establishing a comprehensive surveillance system that would document every aspect of Monica's violations without alerting her to my suspicions. I had spent the weekend researching digital recording devices and had purchased several small cameras designed for home security purposes. The cameras were wireless, motion-activated, and could stream directly to my smartphone, allowing me to monitor Monica's activities in real time even when I wasn't physically present in the treatment rooms. Installing the cameras required careful planning and precise timing. I arrived at the office an hour early, using my administrative access to enter the building before Monica's arrival. The treatment rooms had multiple potential mounting locations where small cameras could be concealed among medical equipment, air fresheners, and decorative elements that patients wouldn't examine closely. I positioned the primary camera behind an artificial plant on the counter in treatment room 2, angled to capture the sterilization area where Monica processed instruments between patients. A second camera went inside the supply closet, focused on the autoclave machine to record actual sterilization cycles versus the fraudulent logs Monica was maintaining. The third camera was mounted near the ceiling in the hallway, providing an overview of traffic flow between treatment rooms and documenting the timing of patient appointments. Each camera was configured to upload footage directly to a secure cloud storage account I had established under a pseudonym, ensuring that even if Monica discovered the devices, the evidence would already be preserved in a location she couldn't access or destroy. I also programmed the cameras to send motion alerts to my phone, allowing me to monitor critical moments even when I appeared to be focused on administrative tasks. The installation process took 45 minutes, and I was back at my desk reviewing appointment schedules when Monica arrived for work. She greeted me with her usual cheerful smile, completely unaware that her every movement was now being recorded by multiple devices that would capture her criminal activities in high-definition detail. Monica's first patient of the day was Thomas Riley, a 42-year-old construction worker who came in for a routine cleaning and complained of tooth sensitivity. I watched through the camera feed on my phone as Monica prepared instruments for his treatment, noting that several of the tools appeared to be the same ones I had seen her use on the last patient the previous day. The sterilization log showed no overnight cycles, confirming that these instruments had not been properly processed. During Thomas's treatment, Monica used a scaling instrument to remove tartar buildup from his gums, causing significant bleeding that she dismissed as normal for someone who didn't floss regularly. The blood-contaminated instrument was then rinsed in the sink and placed on a tray for the next patient, with no sterilization processing whatsoever. Monica completed the treatment in 18 minutes, barely allowing time for Thomas to rinse and pay before ushering him out to prepare for her next appointment. The next patient was Linda Martinez, a kindergarten teacher in her 50s who had specifically requested an early appointment because she was nervous about dental procedures and wanted to get them over with quickly. Monica used the same scaling instrument on Linda that she had just used on Thomas, without any cleaning beyond a quick rinse with tap water. The potential for cross-contamination was obvious and terrifying. What made this particular violation even more disturbing was that Linda mentioned during her treatment that she was recovering from a recent surgery and was taking immunosuppressive medications that made her more susceptible to infections. Monica acknowledged this information, but continued using the contaminated instruments without any additional precautions. She was knowingly exposing an immunocompromised patient to blood-borne pathogens while maintaining the professional demeanor of a caring healthcare provider. I documented every detail of these appointments, noting the specific instruments used, the timing of treatments, and the complete absence of proper sterilization protocols. The camera footage provided irrefutable evidence of Monica's violations, but I needed to understand the full scope of her criminal operation before I could determine the best way to expose it. Over the next several days, I established a routine of covert surveillance that allowed me to monitor Monica's activities while maintaining my normal administrative duties. I used the camera feeds to document patient treatments, photographed sterilization logs and supply inventories, and began building detailed profiles of patients who had been exposed to contaminated instruments. The pattern that emerged was even worse than I had initially suspected. Monica was systematically reusing instruments on every single patient, with no regard for proper sterilization protocols. She had developed an elaborate system of deception that included falsifying sterilization logs, using expired cleaning solutions, and storing supposedly sterile instruments in containers that were never actually sterilized. But the contaminated instruments were just one aspect of a much larger criminal enterprise. As I delved deeper into patient records and billing statements, I discovered that Monica was committing extensive insurance fraud that involved unnecessary procedures, inflated treatment codes, and charges for services that were never provided. The insurance fraud followed a sophisticated pattern that demonstrated Monica's understanding of dental billing systems and her willingness to exploit them for personal gain. Routine cleanings were routinely upgraded to periodontal therapy, increasing reimbursement rates by 300%. Patients who came in for simple examinations were billed for complex diagnostic procedures that required specialized equipment the practice didn't even own. Most disturbing were the patients who were charged for treatments they never received. Monica would bill insurance companies for root scaling, fluoride treatments, and oral cancer screenings that existed only in her fraudulent documentation. Some patients were being charged for multiple visits when they had only been seen once, while others were billed for procedures that were supposedly performed by Dr. Chen when he wasn't even in the office. The financial impact of Monica's fraud was staggering. Based on my analysis of billing records over the previous 6 months, she had submitted over $200,000 in fraudulent claims to various insurance companies. This wasn't casual overbilling or aggressive coding practices. It was systematic theft that violated federal healthcare fraud statutes and put the entire practice at risk of criminal prosecution. But understanding the scope of Monica's crimes was only the beginning of my investigation. I needed to identify patients who had been harmed by her actions and gather evidence that would convince authorities to take immediate action to protect the public. This required accessing medical records, conducting interviews, and building relationships with patients who might not want to acknowledge that their trusted healthcare provider had put them at risk. I began by reviewing post-treatment complications for patients who had been seen by Monica over the previous year. The pattern of infections, delayed healing, and unusual complications was immediately apparent when viewed through the lens of contaminated instrument exposure. Several patients had developed serious infections requiring antibiotic treatment, while others had experienced complications that necessitated additional procedures at other dental practices. One of the most concerning cases involved Maria Santos, a 68-year-old diabetes patient who had developed a severe infection after a routine cleaning by Monica 3 months earlier. Maria had been hospitalized for 5 days, while doctors treated an oral infection that had spread to her bloodstream, potentially life-threatening complication that her primary care physician had described as unusually aggressive for someone with her medical history. Maria's medical records showed that she had been in good health before her appointment with Monica, with well-controlled diabetes and no history of serious infections. The sudden onset of a severe oral infection immediately following dental treatment suggested possible exposure to contaminated instruments, particularly given her compromised immune system. I reached out to Maria under the pretense of conducting patient satisfaction surveys, carefully documenting her experience without revealing my suspicions about the source of her infection. Maria described the cleaning as routine, but mentioned that Monica had seemed rushed and had caused more bleeding than she typically experienced during dental treatments. She also noted that the treatment room had seemed less organized than usual, with instruments scattered on counters rather than neatly arranged on sterile trays. Similar patterns emerged in interviews with other patients who had experienced post-treatment complications. Robert Kim, a 34-year-old accountant, had developed a persistent infection after a deep cleaning that required 3 rounds of antibiotics to resolve. Jennifer Walsh, a teacher in her 40s, had experienced unusual swelling and pain that lasted for weeks after what should have been a routine procedure. Each of these patients had trusted Monica with their health and safety, expecting the same professional care they had received from Dr. Chen's practice for years. Instead, they had been exposed to contaminated instruments that potentially transmitted dangerous pathogens, while being charged for fraudulent procedures that inflated their insurance costs. But the most disturbing discovery came when I began investigating Monica's employment history and professional credentials. The glowing references she had provided during her hiring process painted a picture of an exemplary dental hygienist, with an spotless record and enthusiastic recommendations from previous employers. However, when I began making discreet inquiries, a very different story emerged. Monica's previous employer, Metropolitan Dental Group in the state capital, had terminated her employment after only 8 months, rather than the 2 years she had claimed on her application. When I contacted the practice manager under the pretense of verifying employment dates for insurance purposes, I learned that Monica had been fired for safety violations and suspected fraud, though the practice had avoided formal charges to prevent negative publicity. The pattern of violations at Metropolitan Dental Group was remarkably similar to what I was observing at our practice. Monica had been caught reusing instruments without proper sterilization, billing for procedures that weren't performed, and falsifying patient records to cover up her negligence. The practice had conducted an internal investigation that documented multiple safety violations, but had ultimately decided to terminate Monica quietly, rather than report her to licensing authorities. This revelation transformed my understanding of Monica's criminal behavior. She wasn't a previously ethical professional who had gradually developed bad habits at our practice. She was a repeat offender who had been systematically violating safety protocols and committing fraud for years, moving from practice to practice when her behavior was discovered, leaving a trail of endangered patients and victimized employers. The licensing board had no record of the violations at Metropolitan Dental Group because the practice had failed to report them, allowing Monica to obtain employment at our practice with falsified references and a clean professional record. Her ability to continue practicing despite documented safety violations represented a systemic failure in professional oversight that put patients across multiple practices at risk. Armed with this information, I expanded my investigation to include Monica's entire employment history, contacting previous employers, and attempting to identify other patients who might have been harmed by her criminal behavior. The scope of potential victims was overwhelming, spanning multiple practices over several years, and potentially involving hundreds of patients who had been exposed to contaminated instruments or charged for fraudulent procedures. But my immediate concern remained the patients currently being treated at our practice. Every day that Monica continued working meant more people exposed to contaminated instruments, more insurance fraud, and more potential victims of her systematic criminal behavior. I needed to find a way to protect current patients while continuing to gather evidence for a comprehensive case against her. The solution I developed required precise timing and considerable personal risk. I began intervening in Monica's patient treatments using various pretexts, similar to how I had protected Mrs. Patterson by claiming insurance authorization issues. When I noticed particularly vulnerable patients scheduled for treatment, I would create administrative delays that forced rescheduling until Dr. Chen returned from conferences or appointments. For patients I couldn't protect through administrative intervention, I found ways to observe their treatments directly, using my authority as office manager to enter treatment rooms for legitimate business purposes. During these observations, I would document Monica's protocol violations while looking for opportunities to interrupt dangerous procedures without alerting her to my surveillance. This direct intervention strategy was necessarily limited and couldn't protect all patients, but it allowed me to prevent the most egregious exposures while continuing to gather evidence. Each intervention required elaborate justification and careful management to avoid arousing Monica's suspicions, but the alternative was allowing her to continue endangering patients while I built my case. The psychological strain of maintaining this double life was considerable. I had to interact professionally with Monica every day, responding to her friendly conversations and collaborative discussions, while knowing that she was systematically endangering the patients we were both supposed to protect. The cognitive dissonance of treating someone as a colleague while secretly documenting their crimes created constant stress that affected my sleep, appetite, and overall well-being. But the moral imperative to protect patients overrode my personal discomfort. Every contaminated instrument I documented, every fraudulent bill I discovered, and every patient complication I investigated reinforced my commitment to exposing Monica's criminal behavior, regardless of the personal cost. 3 weeks into my covert investigation, I made a discovery that transformed the scope of the case and revealed connections I had never suspected. While reviewing supply orders for inconsistencies, I noticed unusual purchasing patterns that suggested Monica might be diverting medical supplies for personal use or resale. The practice was ordering significantly more expensive instruments and supplies than our patient volume would justify, but the actual inventory didn't reflect these purchases. Disposable items that should have been used once and discarded were being reused multiple times, while high-value instruments were disappearing from inventory without explanation. Further investigation revealed that Monica had established relationships with medical supply companies that allowed her to purchase products at institutional discounts and then resell them to other practices or individual providers. She was essentially using our practice as a front for a medical supply trafficking operation that generated additional income while compromising patient safety. The supply diversion scheme involved several external partners, including sales representatives who facilitated bulk purchases and other dental practices that served as buyers for the diverted products. Monica had created a network of criminal associates who were profiting from stolen medical supplies, while patients received substandard care with reused disposable items. This discovery led me to examine other aspects of Monica's activities that I had previously attributed to efficiency or cost consciousness. Her reluctance to order replacement instruments, her insistence on maximizing the value of disposable supplies, and her opposition to equipment upgrades were all part of a systematic effort to divert resources for personal profit. The medical supply fraud added another layer of criminal behavior to Monica's already extensive violations, but it also provided additional evidence that could be used to build a comprehensive case against her. The financial records, shipping documents, and communication with external partners created a paper trail that would be difficult for Monica to explain or deny. But perhaps most importantly, the discovery of external partners meant that Monica's criminal operation extended beyond our practice and involved other individuals who were actively participating in medical fraud. This network of co-conspirators represented a broader threat to patient safety and healthcare integrity that required intervention by federal authorities rather than just local licensing boards. I began documenting the supply diversion scheme with the same meticulous attention to detail I had applied to the contaminated instrument violations. I photographed invoices, tracked inventory discrepancies, and identified the external partners who were facilitating the trafficking operation. Each piece of evidence strengthened the overall case while revealing new aspects of Monica's criminal enterprise. The investigation also revealed that Monica had been recruiting other dental practices to participate in similar schemes, offering to share her, quote, efficiency techniques with hygienists at other offices. She had conducted several training sessions at dental conferences, presenting her methods as innovative cost reduction strategies, while actually teaching other professionals how to commit fraud and endanger patients. The scope of potential victims extended far beyond our practice, to include patients at multiple facilities where Monica's techniques had been implemented. The systematic nature of her criminal behavior and her efforts to spread these practices to other providers represented a public health crisis that required immediate intervention by multiple regulatory agencies. But building a comprehensive case against Monica and her network of associates required evidence that would withstand legal scrutiny and result in permanent removal of these individuals from healthcare practice. I needed expert testimony, forensic analysis, and coordination with law enforcement agencies that had the authority to conduct formal investigations and bring criminal charges. The complexity of Monica's criminal operation also meant that exposing it would likely result in criminal charges, civil liability, and regulatory sanctions that could affect not only Monica, but also Dr. Chen and the practice itself. Even though Dr. Chen was innocent of Monica's crimes, his professional reputation and financial security would inevitably be damaged by the scandal that would follow. This realization forced me to confront the broader implications of my investigation and the potential consequences for everyone involved. Exposing Monica's crimes was morally necessary and legally required, but it would also destroy the practice that served as a vital healthcare resource for our community and potentially ruin the career of an innocent man who had dedicated his life to providing quality dental care. The weight of these competing interests created additional psychological pressure as I continued gathering evidence. I was no longer just investigating workplace violations. I was preparing to trigger events that would have profound consequences for patients, colleagues, and the entire community that depended on our practice for dental care. But the alternative was allowing Monica's criminal behavior to continue indefinitely, putting countless more patients at risk of serious harm while she profited from fraud and endangerment. The moral calculus was clear, even if the personal and professional costs would be severe. As my investigation entered its fourth week, I had accumulated overwhelming evidence of systematic criminal behavior that included contaminated instrument reuse, insurance fraud, medical supply trafficking, and conspiracy with external partners. The documentation filled multiple encrypted files and included video recordings, financial records, patient interviews, and expert analysis that would support criminal prosecution. But I also recognized that the evidence I had gathered represented only a portion of Monica's criminal activities. Her operation was sophisticated enough to include backup plans, hidden assets, and contingency strategies that would allow her to minimize consequences if her primary schemes were discovered. The next phase of my investigation would require transitioning from covert surveillance to active engagement with law enforcement and regulatory authorities. I would need to present my evidence in a format that would trigger immediate intervention, while ensuring that Monica couldn't destroy evidence or harm additional patients before being removed from practice. This transition also meant that my role would shift from undercover investigator to public whistleblower, with all the personal and professional risks that such exposure entailed. Monica had already demonstrated her willingness to endanger patients for personal gain, suggesting she would likely retaliate against anyone who threatened to expose her criminal enterprise. But the patients who trusted our practice with their health and safety deserved protection from Monica's systematic criminal behavior, regardless of the personal costs to me or the professional consequences for the practice. The evidence I had gathered represented their best hope for justice, and their only protection from continued exploitation. The quiet office manager who had accidentally discovered Monica's crimes was about to become the primary witness in what would likely become the largest dental malpractice case in state history. The woman who had spent weeks secretly documenting criminal behavior was about to step into the spotlight as the person responsible for exposing a criminal enterprise that had endangered hundreds of patients across multiple practices. But first, I needed to ensure that no additional patients would be harmed, while authorities investigated my allegations and took action to remove Monica from practice. The evidence I had gathered was compelling, but the wheels of justice moved slowly, and every day of delay meant more potential victims of Monica's systematic criminal behavior. The final phase of my investigation would require careful coordination with multiple agencies, strategic timing to maximize the impact of my revelations, and personal courage to face the inevitable backlash from Monica and her associates. The stakes had never been higher, and failure was not an option when patients' lives hung in the balance. Monica had spent months systematically endangering patients while believing that her crimes were invisible to the colleagues around her. She was about to discover that her criminal behavior had been witnessed, documented, and reported by someone with the skills and determination to ensure she faced justice for every patient she had endangered. The transformation was complete. The office manager had become an investigator, the colleague had become an adversary, and the quiet professional who had maintained the practice's administrative functions was about to become the person responsible for bringing down the most sophisticated medical fraud operation in the state's history. The morning I decided to contact authorities dawned gray and cold, matching the weight of responsibility that had settled over me during 4 weeks of covert investigation. I arrived at the office 2 hours early, not to install surveillance equipment or gather additional evidence, but to make the phone calls that would transform Monica's criminal enterprise from a hidden scandal into a public health emergency requiring immediate intervention. My first call was to Detective Sarah Mitchell at the State Healthcare Fraud Division, a specialized unit within the Attorney General's office that investigated medical malpractice and billing fraud. Detective Mitchell had been recommended by a former colleague who worked in healthcare compliance, and her reputation for thorough investigation and successful prosecution made her the ideal person to handle the complex case I was about to present. Detective Mitchell listened without interruption as I outlined the scope of Monica's criminal operation, from contaminated instrument reuse to insurance fraud to medical supply trafficking. When I finished my initial summary, there was a long pause before she spoke. "Ms. Reynolds, what you're describing represents multiple felony violations that put public health at serious risk," she said, her voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood the implications of my allegations. "I need to see your evidence immediately, and we need to coordinate with several other agencies to ensure the situation is handled properly." We arranged to meet that afternoon at the Attorney General's office, where Detective Mitchell would review my documentation with representatives from the State Dental Board, the Department of Health, and federal investigators from the Healthcare Fraud Prevention Unit. The meeting would determine whether my evidence was sufficient to warrant immediate intervention or whether additional investigation would be required. My second call was to Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic dentist who specialized in malpractice cases and had testified in numerous criminal proceedings involving healthcare fraud. Dr. Foster's expertise would be crucial in explaining the medical implications of Monica's violations to investigators and juries who might not understand the risks associated with contaminated dental instruments. Dr. Foster agreed to review my video evidence and provide expert testimony about the potential health consequences of Monica's actions. She also recommended that I contact the Centers for Disease Control to report the possible exposure of multiple patients to bloodborne pathogens, as this represented a public health emergency that required coordinated response from federal agencies. The CDC referral led to a conversation with Dr. James Wu at the Division of Healthcare Quality Promotion, who specialized in healthcare-associated infections and outbreak investigations. Dr. Wu explained that the systematic reuse of contaminated instruments represented exactly the type of exposure event that had led to hepatitis outbreaks at other medical facilities, and immediate patient notification would be required once authorities took action against Monica. These initial contacts established the framework for a coordinated investigation that would involve multiple law enforcement agencies, health departments, and regulatory bodies. The complexity of the response reflected the severity of Monica's crimes and the potential impact on public health, but it also meant that exposing her operation would trigger events that extended far beyond our small dental practice. My final preparation involved securing the evidence I had gathered over the previous month. I created multiple copies of all documentation, stored in various locations and formats to ensure that Monica couldn't destroy or tamper with the materials that would form the foundation of the criminal case against her. The video recordings, financial records, patient interviews, and expert analysis filled several encrypted drives that I distributed to trusted associates who had no connection to the dental practice. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, I walked into the Attorney General's office carrying a briefcase filled with evidence that would expose one of the most extensive medical fraud operations in state history. The conference room was filled with investigators, prosecutors, and health officials who would determine how to respond to Monica's systematic criminal behavior. Detective Mitchell began the meeting by outlining the agencies represented and their respective roles in investigating healthcare fraud. The State Dental Board would handle professional licensing issues, the Department of Health would manage public health response and patient notification, federal investigators would pursue insurance fraud charges, and local prosecutors would handle criminal charges related to patient endangerment. I spent the next 3 hours presenting my evidence to this assembled group of professionals, walking them through Monica's criminal operation step by step. The video recordings of contaminated instrument reuse generated immediate concern from health officials, while the documentation of insurance fraud caught the attention of federal investigators who specialized in healthcare billing violations. Dr. Foster's expert analysis provided crucial context for understanding the medical implications of Monica's actions. She explained that reusing contaminated dental instruments created direct pathways for transmitting hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV, and other blood-borne pathogens between patients. The systematic nature of Monica's violations meant that potentially hundreds of patients had been exposed to these diseases over the course of her employment at multiple practices. The financial documentation revealed an operation that had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent revenue through false billing, supply diversion, and unnecessary procedures. The scope of the fraud extended beyond our practice to include a network of associates who had facilitated the trafficking of medical supplies and the implementation of similar schemes at other facilities. But perhaps most disturbing to the assembled investigators was the evidence of Monica's previous violations at Metropolitan Dental Group and her success in obtaining employment at our practice. Despite a documented history of safety violations and suspected fraud, the failure of professional oversight had allowed a known violator to continue practicing and endangering patients across multiple facilities. By the end of the meeting, the decision had been made to take immediate action against Monica and her associates. Search warrants would be obtained for the dental practice, Monica's residence, and the offices of her co-conspirators. Monica would be arrested the following morning, before she could treat any additional patients or destroy evidence of her criminal activities. The timing of the arrest was crucial, as Monica's daily schedule included several patients who were particularly vulnerable to infections, including elderly individuals and those with compromised immune systems. Every hour of delay represented additional patients at risk, making immediate intervention a public health imperative, rather than just a law enforcement priority. I returned to the office that evening knowing it would be my last normal interaction with Monica before her criminal operation was exposed to the world. She greeted me with her usual friendly smile, discussing plans for the next day's patient schedule while completely unaware that law enforcement officials were finalizing plans for her arrest. The cognitive dissonance of maintaining casual conversation with someone I knew was about to be arrested for criminal endangerment of patients was almost overwhelming. Monica chatted about her weekend plans, complained about traffic during her commute, and asked my opinion about potential improvements to the office scheduling system. Her casual demeanor and apparent normalcy made it difficult to reconcile the friendly colleague with the systematic criminal I had been investigating for weeks. But every smile she offered reminded me of the patients she had endangered with contaminated instruments. Every professional comment about practice efficiency reminded me of the fraudulent billing schemes she had implemented. Every moment of normal interaction reinforced my certainty that exposing her crimes was not only necessary but morally imperative. That night, I received final instructions from Detective Mitchell about my role in the next day's arrests. I would arrive at the office at my normal time, maintain regular routines until law enforcement arrived, and then provide access and assistance as needed during the execution of search warrants. My cooperation would be crucial in ensuring that evidence was properly collected and that Monica's criminal operation was fully documented. I also received notification that Dr. Chen would be contacted that evening and briefed about the situation before arriving at the office the next morning. His reaction to learning about Monica's crimes would likely be shock and disbelief, as he had trusted her completely and had no reason to suspect that his employee was systematically endangering his patients. The phone call to Dr. Chen was handled by Detective Mitchell, who explained the investigation and the evidence that had been gathered against Monica. Dr. Chen's initial response was reportedly one of complete disbelief, followed by horror as he understood the implications of Monica's actions for his patients and his practice. Dr. Chen agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation and to assist in patient notification efforts once Monica was arrested. His primary concern was ensuring that affected patients received appropriate medical evaluation and treatment for potential exposure to blood-borne pathogens, regardless of the impact on his practice's reputation or financial stability. The night before Monica's arrest was sleepless for me, filled with anticipation about the confrontation that would finally expose her criminal behavior while ending her ability to endanger additional patients. I reviewed my evidence one final time, ensuring that everything was properly organized and accessible to investigators who would need to build criminal cases against Monica and her associates. I also prepared for the personal and professional consequences that would follow Monica's arrest. The exposure of such extensive criminal behavior at our practice would likely generate significant media attention, regulatory scrutiny, and civil litigation that could affect everyone associated with the office. My role as the whistleblower who had exposed Monica's crimes would make me a central figure in these proceedings, with all the risks and responsibilities such visibility entailed. But the alternative to exposure was allowing Monica to continue endangering patients indefinitely, a prospect that made any personal consequences seem insignificant by comparison. The patients who trusted our practice with their health and safety deserved protection from criminal exploitation, regardless of the cost to those who provided that protection. At 7:30 the next morning, Monica arrived at the office carrying her usual coffee in Danish, greeting me with the same cheerful smile she had offered every day for the past 8 months. She began preparing for her first patient of the day, completely unaware that federal agents were positioning themselves around the building while finalizing preparations for her arrest. I maintained my normal administrative routines, checking appointment schedules and reviewing patient files while monitoring text updates from Detective Mitchell about the progress of the arrest operation. The tension of waiting for the confrontation while pretending normalcy was almost unbearable, but I couldn't allow Monica to suspect that anything was different about this particular morning. At 8:15, as Monica was setting up instruments for her first patient, the front door opened, and Detective Mitchell entered, followed by 4 other investigators carrying search warrants and arrest warrants. The moment I had been anticipating for weeks had finally arrived. "Monica Torres," Detective Mitchell announced, approaching the treatment room where Monica was preparing contaminated instruments for another unsuspecting patient. "You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, patient endangerment, and conspiracy to commit medical malpractice." Monica's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The confident professional demeanor she had maintained for months disappeared instantly, replaced by shock, confusion, and then desperate denial. She dropped the instrument she was holding, contaminating the floor with the same carelessness she had shown toward patient safety. "There must be some mistake," Monica stammered, looking around the treatment room as if expecting someone to explain that this was an elaborate misunderstanding. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm a licensed dental hygienist with an exemplary record." Detective Mitchell read Monica her rights while other investigators began photographing the treatment room and documenting the instruments that had been prepared for the patient who would now never face exposure to Monica's criminal negligence. The scene was surreal, watching someone I had worked alongside for months being arrested for crimes I had secretly documented in meticulous detail. Monica's eyes found mine across the treatment room, and I saw the moment she realized that her criminal operation had been discovered and reported by someone she had trusted as a colleague. The betrayal she felt was evident in her expression, though she seemed unable to comprehend that her own criminal behavior had necessitated my investigation. "Jessica," Monica said, her voice carrying desperation as investigators secured her hands behind her back. "You know me. You know I would never hurt a patient. Tell them this is all a misunderstanding." I met her gaze directly, feeling no satisfaction in her downfall but complete certainty about the necessity of her arrest. "Monica, I've watched you reuse contaminated instruments on dozens of patients. I've documented your insurance fraud and supply trafficking. I know exactly who you are and what you've done." The realization that I had been investigating her activities for weeks seemed to hit Monica like a physical blow. She sagged against the investigators who were escorting her from the treatment room, her professional facade completely destroyed by the weight of evidence she couldn't deny or explain away. As Monica was led from the building in handcuffs, other investigators began executing search warrants that would collect evidence from every corner of the practice. They photographed contaminated instruments, seized sterilization equipment for analysis, collected patient records that documented fraudulent billing, and gathered financial documents that revealed the scope of Monica's criminal enterprise. The search process took 6 hours and involved specialists in forensic accounting, medical equipment analysis, and healthcare fraud investigation. Every aspect of Monica's operation was documented with scientific precision, creating an evidentiary foundation that would support criminal prosecution and civil litigation against her and her associates. Dr. Chen arrived during the search process, his face reflecting the shock and devastation of learning that someone he had trusted completely had been systematically endangering his patients while committing fraud under his professional license. His reaction was particularly painful to witness, as he struggled to understand how he had failed to detect Monica's criminal behavior despite his commitment to patient safety. "How did I miss this, Doctor?" Chen asked me repeatedly, reviewing evidence that showed Monica's violations had been extensive and systematic. "How could someone do this to patients who trusted them? How could I have been so blind to what was happening in my own practice?" I explained to Dr. Chen that Monica's criminal operation had been sophisticated and deliberately concealed, designed to exploit his trust and the normal assumptions that licensed healthcare professionals would follow basic safety protocols. Her previous experience with similar schemes had taught her how to avoid detection while maintaining the appearance of professional competence. The investigation also revealed that Dr. Chen had been a victim of Monica's criminal operation rather than a participant. She had deliberately exploited his trust and his commitment to providing quality healthcare to cover her criminal activities. His reputation and professional standing would be damaged by association with Monica's crimes, but he bore no legal responsibility for violations he had not known about or authorized. The immediate consequence of Monica's arrest was the suspension of all patient treatments until investigators could determine the full scope of exposure and contamination. The State Dental Board issued an emergency order closing the practice temporarily, while patient notification procedures were implemented and decontamination protocols were established. Patient notification began that afternoon, with health officials contacting everyone who had been treated by Monica over the previous year to inform them of potential exposure to bloodborne pathogens. The calls were devastating for patients who learned that their routine dental care had potentially exposed them to hepatitis, HIV, and other serious diseases. Maria Santos, the diabetes patient who had developed a severe infection after treatment by Monica, was among the first to be contacted. Her reaction was anger and fear, emotions shared by dozens of other patients who faced the possibility that their trusted healthcare provider had endangered their lives through criminal negligence. The media response to Monica's arrest was immediate and intense. Healthcare fraud involving patient endangerment generated significant public interest, particularly when it involved systematic violations at a respected community practice. Television news crews, newspaper reporters, and online journalists descended on our office, seeking interviews and information about the scope of Monica's criminal operation. My role as the whistleblower who had exposed Monica's crimes made me a central figure in media coverage, though I initially declined most interview requests while the criminal investigation was ongoing. The attention was overwhelming and unwelcome, as I preferred to focus on ensuring that affected patients received appropriate care, rather than explaining my investigative methods to journalists. But the public nature of the case also meant that other potential victims of Monica's crimes began coming forward. Patients from Metropolitan Dental Group contacted investigators after seeing news coverage, reporting infections and complications they had experienced after treatment by Monica at her previous employment. The scope of potential victims expanded dramatically as the investigation revealed the full extent of her criminal career. Federal investigators simultaneously executed search warrants at the offices and residences of Monica's associates in the medical supply trafficking operation. These arrests revealed a network of criminal activity that extended across multiple states and involved dozens of healthcare providers who had participated in supply diversion schemes and fraudulent billing operations. The supply trafficking network had generated millions of dollars in illegal revenue while compromising patient safety at numerous healthcare facilities. Monica's role in this larger criminal enterprise made her arrest part of a federal investigation that would ultimately result in dozens of prosecutions and significant reforms in medical supply oversight. Within a week of Monica's arrest, criminal charges were filed that included healthcare fraud, conspiracy, patient endangerment, and racketeering violations. The charges carried potential sentences of decades in federal prison, reflecting the severity of her crimes and their impact on public health and safety. Monica's initial court appearances revealed a defendant who seemed unable to comprehend the seriousness of the charges against her or the evidence that supported them. She continued to maintain her innocence despite overwhelming documentation of her criminal activities, claiming that she had been following standard industry practices and that any violations were inadvertent rather than deliberate. Her defense strategy appeared to center on attacking my credibility as the primary witness against her, suggesting that I had fabricated evidence or misunderstood legitimate medical procedures. This approach was ultimately unsuccessful, as the video evidence and expert testimony provided irrefutable proof of systematic safety violations that could not be explained away as misunderstandings. The trial process took 18 months to complete, during which time additional victims came forward and new evidence of Monica's criminal activities was discovered. The prosecution presented a comprehensive case that documented every aspect of her operation, from contaminated instrument reuse to insurance fraud to supply trafficking. My testimony as the primary witness lasted 3 days and covered every detail of my investigation, from the initial discovery of safety violations to the comprehensive documentation that had led to Monica's arrest. Cross-examination by defense attorneys was aggressive and personal, but the evidence I had gathered was thorough enough to withstand any challenge to its accuracy or interpretation. Expert witnesses explained the medical implications of Monica's actions, detailing how contaminated instrument reuse could transmit deadly diseases, and how her fraudulent billing had diverted resources from legitimate patient care. The testimony painted a clear picture of systematic criminal behavior that had endangered hundreds of patients while generating substantial illegal revenue. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Monica was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, with additional restitution requirements that would force her to repay the fraudulent billing amounts and provide compensation to patients who had been harmed by her criminal activities. Her associates in the supply trafficking network received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with investigators. The coordinated prosecutions dismantled the entire criminal organization and established legal precedents that strengthened enforcement of healthcare fraud statutes. But the consequences of Monica's crimes extended far beyond the criminal justice system. The patients who had been exposed to contaminated instruments faced ongoing medical monitoring and treatment for potential infections. Several patients did test positive for hepatitis after exposure, requiring expensive medical treatment and creating grounds for civil litigation against Monica and the practice. Dr. Chen's practice never fully recovered from the scandal, despite his complete innocence of Monica's crimes. Many patients lost confidence in the safety of dental care at the practice, choosing to receive treatment elsewhere rather than risk association with the facility where Monica had endangered so many people. The financial impact of lost patients, legal fees, and increased insurance costs eventually forced Dr. Chen to sell the practice and retire earlier than he had planned. The regulatory response to Monica's case included significant reforms in dental practice oversight and professional licensing requirements. Enhanced background check procedures were implemented to prevent practitioners with histories of violations from obtaining employment at new facilities. Mandatory reporting requirements were established to ensure that safety violations and suspected fraud would be reported to licensing authorities rather than handled through quiet terminations. New protocols for patient notification and testing were developed to address exposure incidents involving contaminated medical instruments. These procedures ensured that patients would be informed immediately of potential exposure and provided with appropriate medical evaluation and treatment at no cost to them. The healthcare industry also implemented new training requirements for office managers and administrative staff, recognizing that non-clinical personnel often have the best opportunity to observe and report safety violations. My role in exposing Monica's crimes was cited as an example of how administrative oversight could serve as a crucial safeguard against professional misconduct. Professional dental associations revised their ethical guidelines and continuing education requirements to emphasize the importance of infection control and the consequences of safety violations. Monica's case became a cautionary example used in training programs to illustrate how professional credentials and licensing requirements could not guarantee ethical behavior without proper oversight and accountability. The personal impact of exposing Monica's crimes was profound and lasting. My career in healthcare administration was permanently altered by my role as a whistleblower, as potential employers were either impressed by my commitment to patient safety or concerned about my willingness to report misconduct. The experience taught me that doing the right thing often comes with significant personal costs that extend far beyond the immediate situation. But the knowledge that my investigation had prevented countless additional patients from being exposed to contaminated instruments and fraudulent billing made every sacrifice worthwhile. The infections that were prevented, the lives that were potentially saved, and the criminal operation that was dismantled represented achievements that transcended any personal or professional consequences I faced. The relationships I developed with patients who had been harmed by Monica's crimes became some of the most meaningful connections of my life. These individuals, who had trusted their healthcare provider only to be betrayed by criminal negligence, demonstrated remarkable resilience and courage in pursuing justice and recovery. Their strength and determination inspired me to continue advocating for patient safety and healthcare accountability. 2 years after Monica's conviction, I established a consulting practice specializing in healthcare compliance and fraud detection. My experience investigating Monica's criminal operation had taught me how to identify the warning signs of professional misconduct and implement systems to prevent similar violations from occurring. Healthcare facilities across the state began seeking my expertise to strengthen their oversight procedures and train staff to recognize and report suspicious activities. The consulting practice allowed me to channel my investigative skills and healthcare knowledge into preventing the type of systematic patient endangerment that Monica had perpetrated. Each facility I worked with represented hundreds of patients who would be protected from potential exposure to contaminated instruments, fraudulent billing, and other forms of medical malpractice. My work also involved training other healthcare administrators to recognize the signs of professional misconduct and understand their legal and ethical obligations to report violations. Many of these individuals faced the same challenges I had encountered in deciding whether to report suspected crimes by colleagues they trusted and respected. The training programs I developed emphasized that patient safety must always take precedence over professional relationships, personal comfort, or institutional reputation. The consequences of remaining silent about healthcare fraud and patient endangerment were too severe to justify inaction, regardless of the personal costs involved in speaking out. Speaking engagements at healthcare conferences allowed me to share my experience with thousands of medical professionals, administrators, and regulators who needed to understand how systematic criminal behavior could operate undetected within respected healthcare facilities. The response to these presentations was consistently positive, with audience members expressing appreciation for the practical insights and ethical guidance the story provided. The legal precedents established by Monica's prosecution strengthened enforcement capabilities for healthcare fraud investigators and prosecutors nationwide. The comprehensive nature of the case, including documentation of patient harm, financial fraud, and criminal conspiracy, provided a model for investigating similar operations and securing convictions against healthcare professionals who endangered patients for personal gain. Federal agencies incorporated lessons learned from Monica's case into their training programs for healthcare fraud investigators, emphasizing the importance of comprehensive evidence collection and multi-agency coordination in addressing complex medical malpractice cases. The investigation techniques I had developed as an office manager became part of formal protocols used by professional investigators. Patient advocacy organizations recognized my efforts with awards and recognition that helped raise awareness about the importance of healthcare oversight and the role that non-clinical staff can play in protecting patients from professional misconduct. These honors were gratifying, but more importantly, they provided platforms to continue educating healthcare workers about their obligations to report suspicious activities. The financial recovery for patients who had been harmed by Monica's crimes took several years to complete, as civil litigation proceeded through the courts and restitution payments were processed through the criminal justice system. Many patients received compensation that covered their medical expenses and provided recognition of the harm they had suffered, though no amount of money could fully address the trauma of learning that their trusted healthcare provider had deliberately endangered their lives. Some patients who had been exposed to contaminated instruments did develop chronic infections that required ongoing medical treatment and monitoring. Their courage in pursuing legal action against Monica and testifying about their experiences helped ensure that she received appropriate punishment and that other healthcare providers understood the serious consequences of safety violations. The ripple effects of Monica's case extended throughout the healthcare industry, influencing policy decisions, training programs, and oversight procedures that would protect patients for years to come. The systematic reforms that resulted from her prosecution represented a lasting legacy that transformed how healthcare facilities approached infection control and professional accountability. Professional licensing boards across multiple states reviewed their procedures for handling reports of misconduct and implemented new requirements for investigating and documenting safety violations. The failure of oversight that had allowed Monica to move between practices despite documented violations led to significant improvements in information sharing and background verification procedures. Medical supply companies also enhanced their oversight procedures to prevent the type of diversion and trafficking schemes that Monica had operated. New tracking systems and audit procedures made it much more difficult for healthcare professionals to steal supplies or operate fraudulent purchasing schemes without detection. 5 years after Monica's arrest, I received a letter from Maria Santos, the diabetes patient whose severe infection had been one of the early indicators of contaminated instrument exposure. She had fully recovered from her infection and wanted to thank me for the courage to expose Monica's crimes despite the personal and professional risks involved. Maria's letter reminded me that behind every case of healthcare fraud and patient endangerment were real people whose lives had been affected by professional misconduct. The abstract concepts of infection control and billing compliance translated into concrete consequences for patients who trusted healthcare providers with their health and safety. The letter also reinforced my conviction that reporting professional misconduct, regardless of personal consequences, was both a legal obligation and a moral imperative for anyone working in healthcare. The patients who depended on medical professionals for quality care deserve protection from those who would exploit that trust for personal gain. Today, my consulting practice continues to work with healthcare facilities nationwide to strengthen their oversight procedures and prevent the type of systematic misconduct that Monica perpetrated. Each new client represents an opportunity to protect patients from potential harm and ensure that healthcare providers maintain the ethical standards their profession demands. The investigation skills I developed while exposing Monica's crimes have been applied to dozens of other cases involving suspected healthcare fraud, professional misconduct, and patient safety violations. While none have been as extensive or dramatic as Monica's criminal operation, each successful intervention has prevented patient harm and maintained the integrity of healthcare delivery. The experience of serving as a whistleblower in such a high-profile case taught me that individual actions can have profound consequences for public health and safety. One person's willingness to document and report professional misconduct can protect countless others from harm and create lasting improvements in healthcare oversight and accountability. Monica Torres remains in federal prison, where she will serve most of her remaining sentence before becoming eligible for parole. Her medical licenses have been permanently revoked, and she is prohibited from working in any healthcare capacity for the rest of her life. The criminal operation she built and the patients she endangered represent a cautionary tale about the importance of professional oversight and accountability in healthcare. The patients who were harmed by her crimes have largely recovered and moved on with their lives, though many continue to receive medical monitoring to ensure that no long-term complications develop from their exposure to contaminated instruments. Their resilience and determination to seek justice inspired everyone involved in the investigation and prosecution of Monica's crimes. Dr. Chen eventually found peace in retirement, knowing that he had dedicated his career to providing quality healthcare and that his reputation for integrity remained intact, despite his unfortunate association with Monica's criminal activities. His cooperation with investigators and commitment to patient notification demonstrated the ethical leadership that the healthcare profession requires. The dental practice building still stands on Maple Street, though it now houses a different healthcare facility, with new ownership and completely revamped safety procedures. The Victorian architecture remains unchanged, but the protocols and oversight systems within have been transformed by the lessons learned from Monica's systematic patient endangerment. My role in exposing Monica's crimes and the subsequent transformation of my career into healthcare compliance consulting represent a journey from administrative support to patient advocacy that I never could have anticipated. The quiet office manager who accidentally discovered safety violations became a national expert in healthcare fraud detection and prevention. The skills required for effective healthcare administration, detailed record-keeping, careful observation, and systematic analysis proved to be exactly the same skills needed for investigating professional misconduct and building criminal cases against healthcare providers who violate their ethical obligations. The most important lesson from Monica's case is that everyone working in healthcare, regardless of their clinical training or professional credentials, has a responsibility to protect patients from harm and report misconduct when they observe it. The consequences of remaining silent about professional violations are too severe to justify inaction, and the patients who depend on healthcare providers deserve advocates who will prioritize their safety above all other considerations. Healthcare fraud and patient endangerment can only flourish in environments where misconduct goes unreported and accountability is avoided. Creating cultures of transparency, oversight, and ethical responsibility requires the active participation of everyone involved in healthcare delivery, from licensed professionals to administrative staff to regulatory authorities. The systematic reforms that resulted from Monica's prosecution have strengthened healthcare oversight and made it more difficult for similar criminal operations to operate undetected. But preventing future cases of patient endangerment requires continued vigilance and the willingness of healthcare workers to report suspicious activities when they observe them. Monica's crimes were ultimately exposed not by sophisticated regulatory systems or professional oversight bodies, but by an office manager who recognized that patient safety was more important than workplace harmony or personal comfort. This reality underscores the crucial role that non-clinical staff play in maintaining healthcare quality and protecting patients from professional misconduct. The transformation from office manager to healthcare fraud investigator was neither planned nor desired, but it proved to be the most meaningful work of my professional life. The patients who were protected from Monica's criminal activities and the healthcare facilities that implemented stronger safety procedures as a result of her prosecution represent achievements that extend far beyond any individual career success. The quiet woman who discovered contaminated instruments being reused on unsuspecting patients became the person responsible for exposing the most extensive healthcare fraud operation in state history. The colleague who trusted Monica's professional competence became the witness who ensured she faced justice for every patient she had endangered. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to look away when you know something is wrong, regardless of the personal consequences or professional risks involved. The patients who depend on healthcare providers for quality care deserve that level of commitment from everyone involved in their treatment, and their safety must always take precedence over any other consideration. 10 years have passed since that gray morning, when federal agents led Monica Torres away in handcuffs, and the healthcare landscape has been fundamentally transformed by the reforms that emerged from her prosecution. The systematic changes implemented in response to her criminal operation have prevented countless cases of patient endangerment and established new standards for medical oversight that protect vulnerable populations nationwide. The National Healthcare Safety Initiative, established by Congress following Monica's conviction, has become the gold standard for preventing medical malpractice and fraud. The initiative requires comprehensive background verification for all healthcare workers, mandatory reporting of safety violations, and standardized protocols for infection control that eliminate the ambiguities Monica exploited to endanger patients. Healthcare facilities across the country now implement the verification procedures that could have prevented Monica's employment despite her history of violations at previous practices. The system includes cross-referencing with criminal databases, contacting former employers directly rather than relying on written references, and requiring detailed explanations for any gaps in employment history that might indicate undisclosed disciplinary actions. The mandatory reporting requirements ensure that safety violations and suspected fraud are immediately reported to licensing authorities, preventing the quiet terminations that allowed Monica to move between practices while continuing to endanger patients. Healthcare administrators now face criminal liability for failing to report known violations, creating powerful incentives for transparency and accountability. But perhaps most importantly, the standardized infection control protocols eliminate the discretionary procedures that Monica manipulated to reuse contaminated instruments while maintaining the appearance of compliance. The new standards specify exact timing requirements, mandatory equipment checks, and detailed documentation that makes it impossible to skip sterilization steps without creating obvious evidence of violations. My consulting practice has grown into a national organization that works with healthcare facilities, regulatory agencies, and professional associations to implement these enhanced safety measures and train personnel to recognize and prevent misconduct. The expertise I developed while investigating Monica's crimes has been applied to protecting patients at thousands of facilities across multiple states. The training programs we've developed reach tens of thousands of healthcare workers annually, teaching them to identify warning signs of professional misconduct and understand their legal obligations to report violations. The programs emphasize real-world scenarios based on actual cases, including Monica's systematic patient endangerment, to help participants recognize subtle indicators that might otherwise be dismissed or overlooked. Healthcare administrators who complete our certification programs learn advanced techniques for monitoring clinical operations, detecting financial irregularities, and maintaining oversight systems that prevent criminal activity from operating undetected. The curriculum includes case studies from Monica's operation and similar prosecutions that demonstrate how sophisticated criminal schemes can be hidden within legitimate medical practices. The impact of these educational efforts extends far beyond immediate training participants to influence the culture of entire healthcare organizations. Facilities that implement comprehensive oversight systems report significantly lower rates of safety violations, fraudulent billing, and patient complaints, creating environments where quality care flourishes while misconduct is quickly identified and addressed. Federal healthcare agencies have incorporated lessons from Monica's case into their enforcement strategies, developing new investigative techniques and prosecution approaches that address the complex criminal enterprises that can develop within medical settings. The multi-agency coordination that characterized her prosecution has become the standard model for addressing healthcare fraud cases that involve patient endangerment and professional misconduct. The Department of Health and Human Services established a specialized healthcare criminal investigation unit that focuses specifically on cases involving systematic patient endangerment and professional misconduct. The unit employs former healthcare administrators, medical professionals, and fraud investigators who understand the clinical environments where these crimes occur and can identify evidence that traditional law enforcement might overlook. State dental boards have implemented enhanced monitoring systems that track practitioner performance across multiple indicators, including patient complaints, insurance billing patterns, and equipment maintenance records. These systems can identify practitioners whose behavior suggests potential safety violations or fraud, triggering investigations before patients are seriously harmed. The technology infrastructure supporting these oversight systems includes sophisticated data analysis capabilities that can detect patterns indicating possible misconduct. Algorithms monitor billing codes for unusual frequencies of high-value procedures, track supply orders for inconsistencies that might indicate diversion, and flag practitioners whose patient outcomes differ significantly from professional norms. But technology alone cannot prevent healthcare fraud and patient endangerment. The human element remains crucial, requiring healthcare workers at all levels to understand their responsibility for protecting patients and reporting misconduct when they observe it. The courage demonstrated by individuals willing to speak out against professional violations continues to be the most effective safeguard against criminal activity in medical settings. Monica's conviction established important legal precedents that have strengthened prosecution capabilities for healthcare fraud cases nationwide. Federal prosecutors now have clear guidance for building cases against medical professionals who endanger patients, while defense attorneys understand that systematic safety violations cannot be dismissed as inadvertent mistakes or professional disagreements. The sentencing guidelines established through Monica's case ensure that healthcare professionals who deliberately endanger patients face substantial prison terms that reflect the severity of their crimes. The 22-year sentence she received has become a benchmark for similar prosecutions, demonstrating that criminal exploitation of patients' trust will result in severe consequences. Civil litigation resulting from Monica's crimes has also established new standards for patient compensation and healthcare facility liability. Insurance companies now recognize that systematic safety violations create extensive exposure to claims, leading to more aggressive oversight of the facilities they cover, and enhanced requirements for risk management and compliance programs. The financial settlements reached with Monica's victims totaled over $8 million, providing compensation for medical expenses, pain and suffering, and long-term monitoring costs associated with potential exposure to blood-borne pathogens. These awards demonstrated that criminal healthcare providers and the facilities that employ them face substantial financial consequences for patient endangerment. Professional liability insurance requirements have been transformed by the precedents established through Monica's prosecution. Healthcare facilities must now demonstrate comprehensive safety protocols, regular compliance auditing, and robust oversight systems to qualify for coverage. Insurance providers conduct detailed assessments of infection control procedures and require immediate reporting of any suspected violations. The healthcare industry has also implemented new professional development requirements that emphasize ethical obligations and legal responsibilities for patient safety. Continuing education programs for medical professionals now include mandatory training on infection control, fraud prevention, and the duty to report misconduct observed in colleagues. Professional associations have revised their codes of ethics to include specific provisions addressing the obligation to report safety violations and protect patients from professional misconduct. These ethical guidelines carry enforcement mechanisms that can result in professional sanctions, license suspension, and permanent exclusion from medical practice for violations. The patient advocacy organizations that supported victims of Monica's crimes have developed into powerful voices for healthcare reform and patient protection. These groups monitor legislative developments, advocate for stronger oversight measures, and provide support for individuals who experience medical malpractice or professional misconduct. Patient support networks established in response to Monica's case now assist hundreds of individuals annually who face similar situations involving contaminated instruments, fraudulent billing, or other forms of medical negligence. These organizations provide legal resources, medical guidance, and emotional support for patients navigating the complex process of reporting and addressing healthcare violations. Educational campaigns developed by patient advocacy groups have raised public awareness about healthcare rights and the importance of informed consent for medical procedures. Patients now understand their right to observe sterilization procedures, question billing practices, and seek second opinions when they have concerns about their treatment. The media coverage of Monica's prosecution and subsequent healthcare reforms has created lasting changes in how medical misconduct is reported and addressed. Investigative journalists specializing in healthcare issues now receive regular training on recognizing signs of patient endangerment and understanding the complex regulatory environment governing medical practice. News organizations have established dedicated healthcare fraud reporting units that investigate suspected violations and provide public accountability for medical professionals and institutions. These investigative efforts have uncovered numerous additional cases of patient endangerment and fraud, leading to prosecutions and reforms that protect patients nationwide. The transparency requirements implemented following Monica's case ensure that healthcare violations and regulatory actions are publicly reported, allowing patients to make informed decisions about their medical care. Online databases now provide comprehensive information about practitioners' disciplinary histories, facility safety records, and ongoing investigations. Public health agencies have transformed their approach to healthcare-associated infection prevention and outbreak investigation based on lessons learned from Monica's systematic contamination of patients. Enhanced surveillance systems now monitor infection patterns that might indicate contaminated instruments or other safety violations at medical facilities. Rapid response protocols developed in response to Monica's case allow health authorities to immediately notify potentially affected patients and provide appropriate medical evaluation when contaminated instrument exposure is suspected. These protocols have prevented numerous potential outbreaks and ensured that exposed patients receive timely medical attention. Research initiatives funded by federal health agencies have advanced understanding of infection transmission risks associated with contaminated dental instruments and developed new sterilization technologies that make it virtually impossible to reuse instruments without proper processing. These technological advances provide additional safeguards against the type of violations Monica perpetrated. Medical device manufacturers have also enhanced their products based on insights from Monica's case, developing instruments with built-in indicators that show whether proper sterilization has been completed. These innovations eliminate ambiguity about sterilization status and make it immediately obvious when instruments have not been properly processed. Training institutions for dental hygienists and other medical professionals have incorporated Monica's case into their curricula as a comprehensive example of professional misconduct and its consequences. Students learn about the ethical obligations of healthcare providers, the importance of infection control, and the serious legal and professional consequences of safety violations. Professional licensing examinations now include extensive testing on infection control procedures, ethical obligations, and legal requirements for patient safety. Candidates must demonstrate thorough understanding of sterilization protocols and their responsibility to report misconduct observed in clinical settings. The mentorship programs established for new healthcare professionals emphasize ethical decision-making and provide guidance for navigating situations where they observe potential violations or feel pressured to compromise safety standards. These programs help ensure that emerging professionals understand their obligations to patients and their profession. Academic research initiatives have studied Monica's case extensively to understand how systematic criminal behavior can develop within healthcare settings and identify early warning signs that might prevent similar violations. This research has influenced policy development and training programs nationwide. Psychological studies of healthcare professionals who commit patient endangerment crimes have revealed patterns that help identify risk factors and develop intervention strategies. Understanding the motivations and decision-making processes of individuals like Monica has improved screening procedures and oversight systems. Organizational behavior research has examined how healthcare facilities can create cultures that promote ethical behavior and prevent misconduct from developing. The findings have influenced management practices, supervision procedures, and workplace design in medical settings across the country. International healthcare organizations have adopted many of the reforms developed in response to Monica's case, recognizing that patient safety challenges transcend national boundaries. The protocols and oversight systems established following her prosecution have been implemented in multiple countries facing similar challenges with medical misconduct. World Health Organization guidelines for healthcare safety now reference the standards developed through Monica's prosecution as examples of comprehensive approaches to preventing patient endangerment. These international standards help ensure that patients worldwide benefit from the lessons learned through her case. Medical mission organizations and international healthcare development programs incorporate training based on Monica's case to prepare healthcare workers for service in resource-limited settings where oversight may be reduced. This training emphasizes the fundamental importance of infection control regardless of environmental constraints. The economic impact of reforms implemented following Monica's conviction has been substantial but overwhelmingly positive for the healthcare industry. While compliance costs have increased, the prevention of patient harm, reduced liability exposure, and enhanced public trust have generated far greater benefits for healthcare providers and patients. Cost-benefit analyses conducted by healthcare economists demonstrate that the investment required to implement comprehensive safety measures generates significant returns through reduced malpractice claims, lower insurance costs, and improved patient satisfaction. The economic case for patient safety has been definitively established through these studies. Healthcare facilities that have implemented the enhanced oversight systems report improved operational efficiency, reduced staff turnover, and better patient outcomes, in addition to decreased safety violations. The comprehensive approach to quality improvement has created positive synergies that benefit all aspects of medical care delivery. Insurance industry data shows dramatic reductions in claims related to contaminated instruments and healthcare fraud at facilities that have implemented the safety protocols developed following Monica's prosecution. These improvements have led to reduced premiums and enhanced coverage options for compliant healthcare providers. Technology companies serving the healthcare industry have developed numerous innovations inspired by Monica's case, including advanced sterilization monitoring systems, automated compliance tracking software, and integrated reporting platforms that facilitate oversight and accountability. Artificial intelligence applications now monitor healthcare operations for patterns that might indicate safety violations or fraud, providing early warning systems that can prevent patient harm before it occurs. These technological solutions complement human oversight and create multiple layers of protection for patients. Blockchain technology has been implemented to create tamper-proof records of sterilization procedures and medical supply chains, ensuring that compliance documentation cannot be falsified in the manner Monica employed to hide her violations. These innovations provide unprecedented transparency and accountability in healthcare operations. The personal cost of serving as the whistleblower who exposed Monica's crimes was significant and lasting, affecting my relationships, career prospects, and daily life in ways I could never have anticipated. The decision to investigate and report her criminal behavior required sacrificing the comfortable anonymity of administrative work for the scrutiny and responsibility that comes with public visibility. Professional relationships within the healthcare industry were permanently altered by my role in exposing Monica's crimes. Some colleagues viewed me as a hero who had protected patients from serious harm, while others saw me as a troublemaker who had unnecessarily destroyed reputations and careers. The polarized reactions reflected broader tensions within healthcare about accountability and professional loyalty. Personal relationships also faced strain, as friends and family struggled to understand the commitment required to investigate and testify against a colleague. The months of covert surveillance and evidence gathering created emotional distance that persisted long after Monica's conviction and imprisonment. Financial consequences included legal expenses, lost income during the investigation and trial periods, and the costs associated with establishing an independent consulting practice. While ultimately successful, the transition from stable employment to entrepreneurial uncertainty created considerable stress and required significant personal sacrifices. But the satisfaction of knowing that my actions prevented countless patients from being exposed to contaminated instruments and fraudulent billing far outweighed any personal costs. The infections that were prevented, the lives that were potentially saved, and the systematic reforms that emerged from Monica's prosecution created benefits that extended far beyond individual consequences. The relationships developed with patients who had been harmed by Monica's crimes became some of the most meaningful connections of my professional life. These individuals demonstrated remarkable courage in pursuing justice and recovery while supporting efforts to prevent similar harm to others. Recognition from patient advocacy organizations, professional associations, and government agencies provided validation that the difficult decisions made during Monica's investigation had been correct and necessary. Awards and honors from these groups helped establish credibility for the consulting practice and created platforms for continuing patient safety advocacy. Speaking opportunities at healthcare conferences, professional meetings, and academic institutions allowed me to share lessons learned from Monica's case with thousands of medical professionals and administrators. The positive response to these presentations demonstrated widespread support for the reforms that had emerged from her prosecution. The consulting practice that grew from my experience investigating Monica's crimes has provided opportunities to prevent patient harm at hundreds of healthcare facilities across the country. Each successful intervention represents patients who were protected from potential exposure to contaminated instruments, fraudulent billing, or other forms of medical misconduct. Research collaborations with academic institutions, government agencies, and professional organizations have advanced understanding of healthcare fraud and patient safety while developing new approaches to preventing medical misconduct. The practical experience gained from Monica's investigation has informed theoretical research and policy development. Educational initiatives developed through the consulting practice have trained thousands of healthcare workers to recognize and prevent professional misconduct. The curriculum, based on real-world experience, provides practical guidance that helps participants understand their obligations to patients and their profession. Policy advocacy work has influenced legislation, regulatory development, and professional standards at federal and state levels. The expertise developed through Monica's investigation has provided credible perspectives on healthcare reform and patient protection initiatives. Media appearances and interviews have raised public awareness about healthcare rights and patient safety, while demonstrating the importance of transparency and accountability in medical care. These opportunities have helped ensure that Monica's crimes contribute to lasting improvements in healthcare delivery. The legacy of Monica's prosecution extends far beyond the individuals directly involved in her case to influence healthcare delivery nationwide. The systematic reforms implemented in response to her crimes have created safer environments for patients while establishing clear standards for professional conduct that protect both patients and healthcare providers. Future healthcare professionals will benefit from the enhanced training requirements, oversight systems, and ethical guidelines that emerged from Monica's prosecution. These improvements help ensure that new practitioners understand their obligations to patients and are prepared to recognize and prevent misconduct in their colleagues. Patients nationwide now receive medical care in environments with stronger safety protocols, enhanced oversight, and clearer accountability mechanisms because of the reforms triggered by Monica's systematic patient endangerment. The improvements in infection control, billing transparency, and professional accountability provide protection that extends to millions of healthcare encounters annually. Healthcare facilities operate under more rigorous standards and face stronger enforcement mechanisms because of the legal precedents established through Monica's prosecution. These changes create powerful incentives for maintaining high standards while providing clear consequences for violations that endanger patients. The international influence of reforms developed in response to Monica's case helps protect patients worldwide from similar forms of medical misconduct. The standards and procedures established through her prosecution have been adopted by healthcare systems across multiple countries and cultures. Educational institutions training future healthcare professionals incorporate lessons from Monica's case into their curricula, ensuring that new practitioners understand the importance of patient safety and their professional obligations. These educational improvements help prevent future cases of systematic patient endangerment. Research initiatives inspired by Monica's prosecution continue to advance understanding of healthcare fraud and develop new approaches to preventing medical misconduct. The ongoing scholarly attention to her case ensures that its lessons continue to influence healthcare delivery improvements. Monica Torres remains incarcerated in federal prison, where she will serve the majority of her sentence before becoming eligible for parole consideration. Her medical licenses have been permanently revoked across all states, and she is prohibited from working in any healthcare capacity for the remainder of her life. The other members of her criminal network have also served their sentences and face similar permanent exclusions from healthcare practice. The coordinated prosecutions dismantled the entire supply trafficking operation and established clear consequences for healthcare professionals who participate in criminal enterprises. Dr. Chen eventually found peace in retirement, knowing that his life's work had genuinely helped patients, and that his reputation for integrity remained intact, despite his unfortunate association with Monica's criminal activities. His cooperation with investigators and commitment to patient welfare demonstrated the ethical leadership that healthcare requires. The patients who were harmed by Monica's crimes have largely recovered and moved forward with their lives, though many continue medical monitoring to ensure no long-term complications develop. Their courage in pursuing justice and supporting reforms has contributed to lasting improvements in healthcare safety. The dental practice where Monica committed her crimes has been transformed into a model facility for infection control and patient safety. The new owners have implemented comprehensive oversight systems that serve as examples for other healthcare facilities seeking to prevent professional misconduct. My role in exposing Monica's crimes and the subsequent development of expertise in healthcare fraud prevention has created opportunities to protect patients nationwide while contributing to systematic improvements in medical care delivery. The transformation from office manager to patient safety advocate represents a journey that was neither planned nor desired, but ultimately became the most meaningful work of my career. The quiet woman who accidentally discovered contaminated instruments being reused became the person responsible for preventing countless cases of patient endangerment through systematic healthcare reforms. The colleague who initially trusted Monica's professional competence became the witness who ensured she faced appropriate consequences for every patient she had endangered. The investigation skills required for effective healthcare administration proved to be exactly the capabilities needed for detecting and documenting professional misconduct. The attention to detail, systematic analysis, and commitment to quality that characterize good administrative work translated directly into effective fraud investigation and patient advocacy. The moral certainty that patient safety must take precedence over personal comfort, professional relationships, and institutional reputation provided the foundation for decisions that ultimately protected thousands of patients from potential harm. The willingness to challenge authority and risk professional consequences when patients' welfare was at stake represents the fundamental obligation of everyone working in healthcare. The systematic reforms that emerged from Monica's prosecution demonstrate that individual actions can create lasting changes that protect vulnerable populations and improve institutional performance. One person's decision to document and report professional misconduct generated benefits that extend to patients nationwide and will continue protecting people for decades to come. Healthcare fraud and patient endangerment can only flourish in environments where misconduct goes unreported and accountability is avoided. Creating cultures of transparency, oversight, and ethical responsibility requires active participation from everyone involved in healthcare delivery, regardless of their clinical training or professional credentials. The most important lesson from Monica's case is that protecting patients from professional misconduct requires courage from individuals who observe violations and understand their obligation to report them. The consequences of remaining silent about systematic patient endangerment are too severe to justify inaction, regardless of personal or professional costs. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to look away when you know something is wrong. The patients who depend on healthcare providers for quality treatment deserve that level of commitment from everyone involved in their care, and their safety must always be the highest priority in medical decision-making. The woman who discovered Monica's crimes through careful observation and methodical investigation became the catalyst for reforms that transformed healthcare delivery nationwide. The office manager who documented contaminated instrument reuse became the expert who helps facilities across the country prevent similar violations. The colleague who trusted Monica's professional competence became the advocate who ensures that patients receive the protection they deserve from systematic criminal behavior disguised as medical care. The quiet administrator became the voice for patients who cannot protect themselves from professionals who exploit their trust and vulnerability. Monica's systematic endangerment of patients for personal gain represents the ultimate betrayal of healthcare's fundamental commitment to, quote, first, do no harm. The exposure of her crimes and the systematic reforms that followed demonstrate that this commitment remains strong and that individuals who violate it will face appropriate consequences while patients receive enhanced protection. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.